Welcome to the Beau Show. The recent sentences of R. Kelly and Ghislaine Maxwell have put human trafficking and sexual offenses in the white-hot spotlight. It has showed us a very dark side of human nature, the side we knew existed but didn't want to acknowledge. But the truth is, people, both men and women, are trafficked every single day. There is a high demand for it, especially in elite circles. There's also a demand for cheap sex itself, which is why sex workers, aka prostitutes, wish to provide the supply, but don't want the stigma of it, nor do they want it to be criminalized. At FreedomFest in Las Vegas, I spoke with two women, Eliza Bleu and Kaytlin Bailey, who are rather different in their experiences. Eliza was trafficked at a very early age, and now is quite outspoken against sex trafficking. And her story actually has a happy ending, which you will see. Kaytlin is a sex worker and stands firm in her right to be one, but wants the profession, as she sees it, to be decriminalized. I think that on my show that it's important to show different perspectives, whether I agree or not. And I hope that you'll appreciate the respect I try to provide, even if I disagree with someone. Culturally speaking, I think we've gone off a cliff. I do think both conversations were insightful and respectful, but in both cases, I think it proves that the demand for sex, whether through grooming and force or as a business transaction, is quite high. And we have to be extremely diligent with how we treat it and deal with it, since many lives have been traumatized as a result. Although we cannot legislate morality, we can certainly try to give our young people the best chance at life free of misery, while at the same time maintaining freedom. I hope you'll enjoy these conversations. Eliza Bleu, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Eliza, just at the outset, because you're a human trafficking survivor, please tell me briefly the story of how you were trafficked and what happened.
So I'm 41 years old now. So at the time when I was trafficked, I met an individual who was a photographer at a concert in Chicago. And I was 15 years old. I had my driver's permit, so I went, and I like to state my age because by today's standard, the grooming process happens much more quickly. In my case, because we were dealing with like landlines and without social media and without the internet really, it was more phone calls and actually letters.
Physical letters,
so
yeah.
is what he did to groom me. I was homeschooled, so I graduated early. And I think because I came from a family that was, I don't want to say perfect because that sounds not real, but I come from an incredible family that didn't explain to me what abuse was or anything like that. It was almost too perfect. So I try to caution folks when I am telling my story, like, you have to let your kids know that there's evil out here. And so I moved at a very young age as a minor to Los Angeles. The photographer promised me that I would be a star. He told me I would be a model, a rock star, and I believed him, unfortunately. And that was the first time I was trafficked. Pretty cut and dry, I was sex trafficked,
So a common theme that I'm seeing in a lot of trafficking victims is there is a grooming process, the promise of something,
yes.
Promise of career aspirations.
Same with labor trafficking.
Right. So, and that seems very common. And as I think about R. Kelly and his sentence and the Ghislaine Maxwell sentence, are you surprised that these people who did this feel zero remorse even to this day? Does that surprise you at all?
No, not at all.
They don't think what they're doing is wrong?
Well, they're sick individuals that need to be where they are. So in the specifics of Ghislaine Maxwell, I mean, she is a master manipulator and an abuser of women and children. I am friends with some of the survivors of Epstein and Maxwell, and Maxwell specifically has always really blown my mind because she was such a master manipulator. I don't want to say she was worse, because what's worse than being sexually assaulted and physically assaulted and all these things, right? But the manipulation, where these survivors left feeling so like, how did this person that I trusted betray my trust in that manner, knowingly betray my trust? It's a specific type of sick. I don't expect that these folks are going to own up to their depravity, but what I do hope happens is that the public keeps speaking out about it. And I think that we are seeing a hockey stick moment when it comes to human trafficking and especially child sexual exploitation. I think we're seeing a hockey stick moment, and I'm really grateful for that.
20 years for Maxwell, 30 for R. Kelly.
Correct, yeah.
Do you call that justice, or what is justice to a victim? What's the concept of even for you?
Sure. There's no justice. Once you've been sexually assaulted, even once, a piece of you has been taken without consent. There is no justice for that. I think that those cases were very different. A lot of folks want to point to the number, like the R. Kelly. You have to look at the specific case. They got Maxwell where they could. They presented evidence that they had, that they could prove in a court of law. And now I think it's really going to be up to the FBI to hold all Epstein co-conspirators accountable. They have to.
Do you think that they should release the client list?
I think that they should always be mindful that there are survivors out there, and that some survivors might not want to be named. And it's unfortunately...
I'm talking about the clients, those people that solicited it.
Correct, but you have to remember, sometimes from within the grooming process, individuals that are victims also become abusers or are groomed to abuse.
Okay.
So we have to be mindful of these. Human trafficking is extremely nuanced. It's not a cut and dry type of crime. I just want to make sure everybody's safe, but also, yes, I think that the FBI should hold all Epstein co-conspirators accountable. So
we're in Las Vegas, which is a big city for trafficking.
Yeah.
What do you think are the conditions that make trafficking easy? I think digital, you even mentioned, because of the modern age we're in, and also what steps can law enforcement and politicians specifically do to stop it?
I'm not too big on law enforcement or on politicians, but what folks can do is talk to their children. Have an open dialogue with their children. So some of the breeding ground that would make trafficking, folks that are undocumented, LGBTQ+, indigenous populations, folks that are struggling financially, either rural or in urban area. There are so many factors that create at-risk, vulnerable populations. As far as law enforcement, just see folks as human. And before you slap an arrest charge on someone that could potentially be a victim, please talk to them. That would be my one request of law enforcement. Because unfortunately, when trafficking survivors, victims, get a prostitution charge, it could ruin the rest of their life. If someone's a victim of human trafficking and they get a prostitution charge, it could ruin the rest of their life.
What makes that determination between being a true victim and being a prostitute?
You say it.
Okay.
So to law enforcement, you would just say it. What's the delineation in real life?
Yeah.
So human trafficking is force, fraud, or coercion for the sale of labor or sex. And there are some other crimes in there that are umbrellaed under human trafficking. If someone's a willing adult sex worker, that's a completely different it's a completely different thing. The other thing, too, is anyone under the age of 18 is automatically, that's selling sex, is automatically considered a human trafficking victim.
So we do have some sex workers here that I've interviewed, and so I talked with them about the trafficking potential that's there. You seem to be an advocate and okay with legitimate sex work.
I'm not an advocate for legitimate sex work. I don't care what willing adults do behind closed doors. That's none of my business, and I don't care.
But do you think that the decriminalization of it, or even the legalization of it, leads to a slippery slope to trafficking and or abuse and rape?
I've seen no evidence globally when we have done that it has decreased human trafficking. My primary focus is going to be on human trafficking. What willing adults do behind closed doors is really none of my business. But if I have to speak on that specifically, I would say decriminalize it, because I don't want trafficking survivors to catch cases being called prostitutes. That's what I don't want.
And do you think that's happening often, more often than not?
Even minors are being charged.
So the assumption by law enforcement at that point is that the person that's making the call, because I've heard this from sex workers too, they call 911, is that they're going to go to jail for bringing the prostitute. But you're saying now that the victims of...
Maybe I was a little cold there. I don't want willing adult sex workers to be in a position where they cannot call the police, where they have to be sexually assaulted, sexually abused. That I don't want. So I don't want to sound cold there, where I'm not thinking there are survivors from within there as well.
Sure.
So I don't want to, maybe I sounded too cold.
Kaytlin, thank you so much for joining me today on the Beau Show here in Las Vegas, FreedomFest, where there's a very diverse exchange of ideas, and you're someone who has a very unique perspective, which I want to gain today. This is kind of a laboratory for a lot of different types of ideas, especially libertarian ideas, which you don't see in other conferences, and I think that's unique. You are a sex workers' rights advocate. What rights do you want to see personally?
I think the most important and urgent issue is to stop the arrests, right? We are hoping to build towards a future where sex workers who are already members of our community can be full contributors to those communities. But stigma, shame, and most importantly, the criminalization prevents us from reporting violence committed against us, reporting other crimes, from being able to lend our wisdom and experience to our communities. And so we're hoping to create a future where no one is arrested, evicted, fired, or loses custody of their children just for engaging in consensual adult sex work.
You say, I've seen on your website, it says that policing prostitution isn't protection, it's patriarchy.
That's true.
That's what you say. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, if you look at the history of the way that we police prostitution, we police the freedom of movement, freedom of association, and freedom of expression, mostly of women. The first federal anti-prostitution law in this country was the 1910 White Slave Law, which made it a crime to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes, right? We did not rescue any sex slaves, but we did inconvenience a lot of chorus girls on their way to the next gig. When we really started enforcing these laws, the federal government conflated prostitution with promiscuity in 1917 with the American Plan, making it very dangerous for women to be walking or eating or just sort of out in public alone. God forbid they make the wrong kind of eye contact with a police officer and they're accused of promiscuity. The next thing they know, they find themselves at a lock hospital. So what we find is that moral panics end up creating excuses to erode the civil liberties of lots of people. And you don't have to have ever engaged in the sex trade to be feeling the repercussions of that. When we made exceptions to Article 230 in 2018 with Sesta Fosta, we erased a lot of content from the internet, not all of it erotic. And now I'm starting to hear complaints here at FreedomFest about, censorship run rampant. Sex workers were trying to raise that issue many, many years ago.
I think about even back to biblical times, even with Mary Magdalene stoning the whore. There certainly has been a history of this even long before America was created.
Yes.
But you seem to think the system of laws now that we have is designed to protect the male client, but not the prostitute who's the provider of the services.
I don't think that's true. I think there's a really dangerous, legal trend in actually criminalizing clients and third parties. It's called the end demand model, sometimes referred to as the Nordic model.
Okay.
People are trying that in places in the States. And what we found is that everywhere that this policy is implemented, violence against sex workers goes up because you're reducing the negotiating power of sex workers. When you threaten to arrest the client or when you threaten to arrest, the landlord or the person answering the phone or the person who's putting up, the people that sex workers hire, right, as, people to help run the business, you end up making it harder not only for us to do our job, but more importantly for us to keep ourselves safe. So I can't tell the difference, for example, between somebody who, for screening, for example, right? So if, we wanted to set up an appointment of some kind, we live in a country that has end demand laws, I say, hey, I'm going to need your legal name, some references, a little bit about you before booking this appointment. If you say no, I can't tell if it's because you're a predator posing as a client that wants to keep your identity secret, or if you're a reasonable, rational person that doesn't want to provide evidence of a crime that you're committing. So going after either side of the transaction pushes it further underground, and we know what prohibition does to markets, and it doesn't make them safer.
But does it also mean that, don't most men who solicit sex work also want discreetness no matter what?
Yeah, I think that's part of the service that's being provided, absolutely. I think it depends. There are certainly proud clients out there, but most people want to keep their sex lives discreet.
Right. So you were for the decriminalization of sex work,
Yes.
and this is something that was new to me hearing this at Freedom Fest, but are you also for the legalization of it, and if not, why?
Yeah, the legalization and the regulation of sex work leads to a lot of really bad outcomes. We're here in Nevada, right? It's the only state with legal, regulated prostitution, and it has the highest arrest rate per capita for prostitution-related offenses because it forces people to work within the legally licensed structure of the brothels, and this is a system that really only benefits brothel owners. Yeah.
So do you think that if we legalize or decriminalize sex work, that it is though it's society making it acceptable, the same way that once drugs have been legalized, it incentivizes people to use drugs? Do you see it that way?
I think that, sex work is something that's been around for a long time. It's older than money.
It's the oldest profession is what it's called, right?
Right. And so I don't think that removing criminal penalties increases the engagement with prostitution. New Zealand, for example, decriminalized legalized prostitution in 2003, and there wasn't a huge uptick in like the ads that were seen or like the number of people seeking services. But what you can do is you can make this work more safe.